So Loga,
about half.
One poll. He can do it.
About half. Yeah. I feel like things are just kind of getting sidetracked here. It's kind of getting a little boring because I thought we were talking about the end of history here, and no one's really decided like who defined that term or what it means. And now I guess we're getting close to the point where we can finally talk about this because we're talking about Hegel and Deleuze, right? Well, who's like the figure right in between Hegel and Deleuze? Who does Deleuze even read Hegel through? And
Hippolyte or Hippolyte, right?
It's Kojève.
Kojève, yes.
Specifically Kojève. And Kojève is the important person, I think, when it comes to defining the end of history. I think he's the only one who's done it adequately. And that's the only real interpretation I think is like worth talking about. Because we can talk about these other abstract ideas of what an end of history is.
Why don't you summarize it? Why don't you summarize Kojève?
Okay, absolutely. So Kojève's understanding of the end of history is in regards very specifically to juridical phenomenon in the West, in particular law. So the question of history is that of the relationship of the classes in social relations. It's that of production, which I feel like Bard was sort of getting to when you start talking about like, okay, so we have like the eternal return when we start living like, less nomadic lives and these sorts of other things, right? Like all of these ideas are tied to the societies in which they're created. So it's implicitly like the social relations, specifically in a class structured society, right? So in the West, what we have is the move from the eternal world of the master society in which there is a master class and a slave class. This is the norm for the majority of human history, to one in which those roles start to merge into themselves, right? And that's what the dialectic is ultimately in history, is between the masters and slaves in legal terms becoming identical in the concept of the citizen, which is where we are now. So we don't have we have like the leftover remnants of like master societies and slave societies. There's still slavery, etc., but there is still the concept of the citizen has expanded and is continuing to expand. And juridically and legally, we have not seen it very much change or go backwards, you might say, towards one that describes like two different classes of people in which a master follows a certain set of laws and a slave follows a different set of laws, or that they have different abilities to represent themselves juridically. The only case we have in which that's true today is through capital, right? So the question of the end of history is like, we're at the position where the way Kojève sees it is that the idea of the end of history is just the concept of the citizen in legal terms expanding. So the idea ultimately would be the universal homogeneous state in which people are all citizens of the world, right? And that would mean that they're legally protected. So when you talk about something like the UN, and it's like, well, where does the UN talk about this idea of like, where did human rights come from? Well, it's hard to like, they're not going to say it comes from God anymore, obviously, right? What they would say is they would come from history. And what they mean by history is ultimately precedents and like juridical changes over centuries.
The bricolage of history, in other words, being
well, it's mostly like in really small ways, right? Because it's like you look at the development of the Anglo legal system, which is like extremely important, or like the Napoleonic Code, which is what Kojève specifically talks about. These things are all coming from like cases and precedents, and the idea of like of justice developing for a very long time. I mean, like the common law tradition in England, for instance, is like one of the most important
Judaism. Judaism is not.
Yeah, that too, of course.
Yeah.
Well,
Anglo-Talmudic, in other words.
The Napoleonic Code is almost the basis for like almost all legal systems in that after. Like Japan basically uses the Napoleonic Code. Like
this is what Kojève says when he says it's the end of history, right? He's saying like, okay, you have all these communist revolutions. What is it really? And what he means by really is like legally in the long term is what it is the Napoleonic Code coming to Russia, or the Napoleonic Code coming to China, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's the correct reading of Kojève's understanding of Hegel. Of course, is the vulgar reading of Hegel. This is like Hegel as the founder of the.
You could say that, but it's the Marxist. It's like the post.
Hegel is way more than that. Yeah, it's very. Marxist.
I know. I can understand.
Even the vulgar
You seem very much attracted to what Lukács would call like a rationalism. That seems to be where you're going. Like you're very much more in favor of like the mythic idea of time and history than you are, say, like a very kind of vulgar, as you say, materialist understanding of just like class societies.
I'm an emergentist, let's put it that way. So
yeah, that's like kind of like you're praying ultimately.
Wait, Gio, what was your point? Because we were.
Well, no, I think the point being is that the problem, and this comes up with Kojève's conversations with Leo Strauss, is that ultimately he's talking about a material recognition of all peoples in the universal ahistorical universal homogeneous state. So eventually all citizens of the world, the whole I'm a citizen of the world idea, eventually that constitutes what Hegel called recognition, where it goes beyond even just like quote unquote like Anglo-Talmudic right frameworks. It's more of just that one totality of an expression that everyone in the world is being quote unquote recognized by this like endpoint,
by the legal system specifically.
Exactly.
Or also, what about like the
material?
Like the affirmation. So, for example, in certain SJW comics, affirmation of someone's identity would be a very important
but this is what I wanted to jump off of. This is what particularly Mr. Bard here writes in Digital Diabolica. But before I get to that, I wanted to jump off what Joel was saying about this line between Hegel, Kant, Bergson. The problem really always goes back to something that's perennial and something that's fundamental within all philosophy and with all issues of what is history itself, which is being and becoming. We know this. So on the one hand, the Heideggerian in me, when we were talking, comes out and says that
history, and I side more with the mythic view of history, that it is a revealing and concealment. It is being revealing itself, and I would say through things like religion, philosophy, but in particular the work of art. In every single epoch is cemented this uniting of the content of history itself with the world of a particular era. And so Heidegger talks about this in, being in the work of art. So really what we forgot with accentuating space and the conquest of space and instrumental reason, all of this sort of Enlightenment project, that it forgot becoming, it forgot temporality, and it forgot the flux of time. And so people like, to an extent, Nietzsche, Heidegger, maybe Deleuze, they want to get back to this fundamental reality of becoming and of temporality. And I think this is where the conversation gets grounded. So the thing with the end of history is that when we talk about our own episteme, and again, that's very, Foucauldian language, we talk about the digital sort of giving us in some ways, and in some ways I think this maybe comes out in Alexander Bard's writing, the digital reality of globalization and techno-capital and telecommunications. For the first time, apart from the use of myth and the work of art, now we fully get to see that recognition in real time. And we're but there's a lot of downsides to it, because now we're talking about the whole platform of the world fully recognizing itself through not just memory, but the memory of being able to record ourselves and being able to play it back and so forth, but also the fact that that there's a temptation to broadcast and to project ourselves for this sort of thirst for recognition that ultimately will play into the hands of what Deleuze would call the societies of control, because now the subject is not this sort of mythic entity. Rather, it's a set of information and an input and output mechanism that then the societies control and gather and collect and so forth. And so a lot of what we're talking about has always sort of been present throughout history. So this whole notion of, it's very similar to what Horkheimer and Adorno said about the nature of like myth versus instrumental reason. Instrumental reason was always there. Same with the societies of control or humanity becoming a data set. It was always there.
Yeah, that's where the term arithmetic comes from, is the medieval basically control theory.
Exactly. But the reason I wanted to bring this is because it almost seems that, and Logo, he talks about this as well, while he tweets about this, we're still subject to this fundamental process of a coming into an end of history of sorts. By end, we mean this proliferation of hypermodernity through various different meta-narratives and various micro-narratives that we're sort of inculcating in the present. So, for example, if you believe that, it was all Iranian civilization, or it was all the Greeks, or it was all the Scythians, it's like, it seems we're building this bricklage of historicities that grade against each other, that are in these little micro bubbles, and we're extending these various narratives out towards the totality of human history. But we can only do this because we have access to various aspects of digital modernity that is informing our subjectivity. Our sense of self has been exploded to the point where we need to recapitulate some sort of wholeness or integration or grounding of being itself with various like narratives that are contradictory and perspectival. And this is what, you know, Nietzsche and Deleuze and so forth and Heidegger is talking about, because it seems that even in this chat right now, what we're doing is a product of that, because we all have our different perspectives on the grounding of history itself, but it still comes back to that that sort of indeterminacy that we're experiencing right now in our own episteme, in our own epoch.